The Witch Hunt Narrative by Ross E. Cheit, or I'm not sure how to say this dude's last name. Um, this is an excellent book. Those of you who were commenting on some of my reviews about the Franklin scandal, this is a must-have book as well. This is not a cheap book. This is a pretty serious volume here, but this came out, I believe, in 2010. Let me just double check that. But this is, thousand pardons. This is actually from 2014, so more recent than I had originally thought. But the Witch Hunt Narrative. Now, what this book does is Ross goes back and covers in considerable depth, goes back to a lot of the daycare sex abuse scandals of the 80s and revisits these cases and kind of applies his own litmus test to these cases about, were these real instances of satanic panic or a witch hunt, or were these legitimate multiple offender, multiple perpetrator, and multiple victim abuse cases. And he comes to the conclusion that yes, these were all very much very real, very bad child abuse cases involving multiple offenders and multiple victims. And any of you who have looked into the subject of SRA, or as it's come to be called, but satanic ritual abuse or ritual abuse cases in general, will know just how sensitive a topic it is. Just my own experience with it. I worked at a group home in the mid 90s, and I'll try to keep this very vague for privacy purposes, but suffice it to say that I encountered several classic ritual abuse cases in my time, and they were not urban legend, not by a long shot. And these were not cases where crazy right-wing Christian therapist coerced a child to concoct a tale of abuse. In fact, in my experience, the cases we typically dealt with were children that were pulled out of a home because of something like mom or dad were dealing drugs out of the house, or mom or dad got shot in the act of doing something else illegal or whatever. So the kids got removed from the home, and then in the course of interviewing the kids away from the parents, or in the course of medical examinations, abuse came out, and that snowballed and led to other things. Very rarely did I personally ever encounter a child disclosing ritual abuse or anything like that, because one of the sad realities of child abuse is people, even kids that are sadistically abused, still, mom is still mom and dad is still dad, and kids love their parents no matter what. That's all you know. That's your frame of reference. So even if you have a sadistically abusive mother or sadistically abusive father, it is very difficult to divorce yourself from the fact that that is in fact your mom and your dad. So let me just state for the record that my personal opinion, I have no doubts as to whether or not ritual abuse is something that exists. There's plenty of evidence out there, and if you talk to people in the mental health profession, you'll hear plenty of cases. Now, if you approach it asking, hey, tell me about satanic ritual abuse, people will withdraw and shut down because they don't want to say something that compromises their career or possibly one of their clients. But if you approach it in a tactful way, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of people with firsthand knowledge of that. But again, it is a very, very touchy subject. So I had a very low level role, and I saw enough to make me very certain that this was a very real phenomenon. But that aside, one of the things that got me into digging into this again was my original experience was in the mid 90s. And at the time, there was no question I was seeing what I was seeing. So I didn't really doubt that this was or was not a thing. It wasn't until I was at a party, I think in 2009 that a friend of a friend was at this party, and she was going on and on about child abuse and how these were typically false allegations, and then she started talking about how most child abuse, and especially like ritualistic child abuse, is all just urban legends and just all made up by therapists. And up until that point, I'd never really heard that particular viewpoint, mainly because at the time when I was living that out, there was no doubt as to what I was seeing. So I kind of questioned her a little bit about, where are you coming from? Now, I do find it interesting. I'm far enough away from that experience as well to say this lady, I did realize later, was going through her own situation where she was being accused of neglect with her own children. So that probably played a part into some of her attitudes about the validity of child abuse claims. So back to the witch hunt narrative. Some of the big cases of the 80s are, of course, the McMartin case, the McMartin preschool case, the Country Walk case down in Florida. There was another case down in Austin. The case in Austin and the case in Florida both resulted in convictions. And the McMartin case resulted in some convictions, but some acquittals as well. It's a really odd case. But what Ross does is he goes back and re-examines the evidence and I think interviews some of the victims. It's been a while since I've read this in its entirety, so but he goes back and interviews the available witnesses and comes to the conclusion that the idea of this witch hunt narrative, as he calls it, or the satanic panic narrative, is not correct. That there really were actionable cases all through the 80s involving preschools, and more importantly, multiple perpetrator and multiple victim cases. And I emphasize that because that's, for some reason, that's become kind of a dirty word in the investigating abuse. One-on-one abuse, if you're dealing with one perpetrator and one victim, or one perpetrator and multiple victims, is not seen as taboo, and that's seen as, oh, that guy's nuts, we need to lock him up. But the idea of multiple perpetrators becomes a problem. And typically it becomes a problem because there is some kind of ideology or there's some kind of other agenda at play. Because it's not just you can't pass it off anymore as a lone nut. So there's something else happening there. And that's what this book gets at, is showing that, stripping away that media bias that we've seen over the last 30 plus years now, of really building on this idea that this whole wave of daycare cases and whatnot was all just the result of this mass hysteria. And as he points out here, this is very much not hysteria. These were very real nuts and bolts cases. Highly recommend this. This is a great follow-up. This dovetails nicely with books like the Franklin cover-up, the Franklin scandal, Nick Bryant's book specifically, because again, this shows that this is a very real phenomenon, a very real problem that deserves very real attention. And sadly, the public relations war was, on some levels, almost won in the public eye by people like the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, because there's a lot of people that still believe today that a lot of this was just based on pure hysteria, that was based on over imaginative therapists that were suggesting these things to their patients. All these children are now grown now, so it is fascinating to see this look back at some of these cases and see a more thorough examination of those. But highly recommend it. It's not cheap. I can't remember what this went for when I got it, but it's a must-have if you're a serious researcher of ritual abuse and organized crime. And I'll end with this on why I say that about ritual abuse and organized crime. Organized crime is, at its core, supported by ritual activity. And to that, by that I mean, take for example the cartels in Mexico and the Saint Muerte death cult. A lot of the hitmen in Mexico subscribe to this. It's a literal theology of worshiping Saint Death. That you'll find that in organized crime, for a lot of people to participate in this, they have to believe that there's some bigger motive, that they're participating in something that might seem twisted on the surface, but they, the insiders, know that there's actually this bigger picture thing that they're participating in that makes them feel like they're actually doing something noble. So you see that a lot as you start peeling back the layers of organized crime. There's a lot of ideological motivation, and there has to be, because you think about it, the rank and file general public do not, the idea of killing for profit sounds good in fiction, but when you're actually faced with what that really means, and people think, wow, for my soul, what does that mean? But if you can give them an ideology that supports that, that says actually what you're doing is actually potentially a good thing or good for your cause, for your special group, then it's a little bit easier to convince people to go along with these things. And I really think that's an important consideration when you're investigating organized crime, to understand that there is an ideological component to that that needs to be considered. And a lot of times that is, for lack of a better way to put it, just straight up Satanism or different various death cult religions. And that is about the only way you can really prop that up. You have to have something that people are more afraid of than death. And when you get into some of those ideologies, that starts to become a little bit more clear. But a little bit of a ramble there. But the Witch Hunt Narrative, great book by Ross E. Cheit, or I know I'm not saying the dude's name right, but great book. Cannot recommend this enough. It's expensive, but it's worth it. Definitely worth having in your library, especially if you're serious about this sort of thing, especially ritual abuse kind of research.